Hello and welcome to today's webcast, Attracting and Motivating Talent in a Volatile Economy. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of the polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. To respond to a poll, click the button next to your answer. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget to open a PDF file that you can save to your computer. Don't worry if you can't download your PDF certificate today. We'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our attendance sheet to receive CPE credit. The attendance sheet is available in the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit can be awarded only to participants registered as themselves and isn't available to participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see isn't legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
I'm pleased to introduce today's presenter, Mark Steranka. Mark is the business consulting partner here at Moss Adams. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Mark.
Great. Thanks, Dustin. And thanks, everyone, for joining. We've got a great turnout for this webinar. Welcome from sunny Seattle. Yesterday, not so sunny. Today, quite sunny. We've got representation, from Hawaii to Florida and New York. So thank you so much, whether it's morning or afternoon for you, and I think we have almost every industry that Moss Adams serves represented, so we have a really great collection of folks participating. So today we're going to talk about certainly attracting and retaining and motivating talents. Some of the things we'll talk about are going to be irrespective of sort of what type of market conditions we're in, but we're certainly going to talk about some of the things that are sort of we're dealing with today, some of the unique opportunities and challenges they're presenting. If this was an interactive webinar, I think we'd have an amazing discussion, but I'll just have to do my one side of that to make it happen for all of us. So learning objectives. We're going to talk about market challenges. We're going to talk about some of the challenges that exist anyway for things like population demographics. We'll certainly talk about challenges that we're all dealing with due to COVID-19. So strategies, definitely focusing on how we attract, retain, motivate employees, some of the new considerations that we should have in mind given what's going on. We're going to focus in on employee engagement and how we achieve high employee engagement, because we submit that's actually the most critical thing that you can do to attract, retain, and motivate your employees and become what we would call a high-performing organization. And then some really practical things that you can do in that regard. How do you become a high-performing organization? How do you achieve high employee engagement, and that's going to translate into attracting, retaining, and motivating your employees in a good market or a bad market, but we'll certainly talk about today's market. So we'll cover market factors, again, some new things that we should all be thinking about. A lot of what we'll talk about, we at Moss Adams can relate to as a firm because we're going through it just like you are. We always kind of talk about the need for sort of a different perspective in terms of how do we attract and retain people, and what kind of perspective do we have to do that, and then how we need to think even a little bit more differently now, and then we'll focus in on employee engagement strategies. So we're going to start off, just given we're sort of tailoring this webinar with our first polling question. So over to you, Dustin, to read that.
All right, our first polling question for today is, as a result of the impact of COVID-19 on the economy, has your organization A, implemented layoffs, B, furloughed employees, C, reduced employee hours, D, all of the above, or E, none of the above? And I'll give everyone a few moments to respond. And to participate, please make sure you click the button next to the answer you choose and hit submit. As a reminder, if you'd like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of our polling questions. We'll allow just a few more moments here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and switch it over and pass it back to you, Mark.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, you know, I was going to try to be a little bit cute and say, geez, if we get a high percentage of E, I'll be very impressed. And I guess I need to be very impressed. So a little over 50%, none of the above, which is awesome, right? So that says that you were able, or have been able to, or continue to be able to sort of weather the storm of what the impacts that COVID's having on the economy. As a firm, we've been dealing with a couple of these options. We've weathered it pretty well ourselves, but that's a great response. That's impressive to see. So let's talk about some of the market factors. So really going to focus in on 3 market factors, one that's sort of germane to conditions today. The first one is population demographics, just what's happening. This is going to be a focus on baby boomers, how they're impacting our organizations, what are we doing relative to it. COVID-19 impacts, even though a really strong percentage haven't had to take those actions, I'm sure, though, COVID-19 is still impacting how you're operating, and so what's that doing to our organizations? And then what's happening in the marketplace in terms of employee engagement. So let's dive into the first one, population demographics. So here are just the basics. We could add Generation Z here, but 4 of the 5 major generational categories. And you can see age ranges, median age in this year, total count. And so, you know, one of the first challenges that all of us or I assume most of us in terms of our organizations, unless we have really, really young sort of demographics in our organizations, is we're dealing with the first challenge that's highlighted here, which is we have a lot of baby boomers every year retiring. And so we're having that outflow of talent, of resources, in a lot of cases institutional knowledge. We have to be able to backfill that, and just from a resource standpoint, we have the challenge of we have far fewer Generation X than baby boomers. And so how do we deal with that challenge? And then that extends to Generation Y or millennials so then what do we do to fill that void? Do we we manage to get the same amount of product and service sort of out the door with fewer people due to fewer Generation X than baby boomers? Do we use technology to do that? Do we sort of upskill the Generation Y upskill only because of lack in years of experience that they would have in order to fill that gap in terms of their resource requirements, or some of each. And so that's a challenge. If folks on the phone were from like a small, it doesn't necessarily be a family-owned business, this would be clearly one of those generational conversations. Let's say mom and dad own the business and they've got kids in it, and their kids are going to tend to be in this Generation Y or millennial bucket. Are they ready to take over? Are they ready to have the baton passed to them? What do you need to do about that to get them ready? And there are lots of different ways you can do that. Same challenge resides within larger organizations that are dealing with that at different levels within the organization. So second challenge, here are just some basics. We'll get into the impacts of COVID-19 more, but we're all dealing with some degree of this, right? We have people working from home. Here at Moss Adams, we have 100% of our people working from home. So that's, roughly 3,500 people, and we've shifted from an office environment to a virtual environment, in essence, basically overnight. Working with limited or no in-person interaction. If you're essential business, then you're probably having people in working at your places of business to some extent, maybe full extent, maybe partial, and have some of that interaction. Or an organization like ours, we have no in-person or have been having no in-person interaction during this pandemic. And then, of course, to support that, most of our organizations are likely relying more on technology. And I remember I've got 5 kids. My middle son kept saying, because I travel a lot, it's like, why don't your clients and your businesses use video more? I just don't understand it. That seems silly. And now we see it actually took something like a pandemic to really spur the use of that. And so one of the questions, so what will be the lingering effect of that? So we're all dealing with these impacts and how we operate our organizations, and relative to people under the attracting, retaining, motivating, as we are hiring, and organizations are still hiring during this process. How are we doing that? How are we retaining? Because these dynamics do put strains on our organizations, as we'll talk about. So before we segue to employee engagement, we have a sort of a precursor question. So back to you, Dustin.
Thanks, Mark. So our question is, pre-COVID-19, what is the average level of employee engagement in the U.S.? And A, at least 75%, B, at least 50%, but less than 75%, C, at least 25%, but less than 50%, or D, below 25%.
And so this is just your guess, your estimate of what you think employee engagement is across the U.S., getting your opinion. And then we'll see some results, both your results and actual results.
Yep, and I'll give it a few more seconds here, let everybody answer, and then we'll see what we have to say here. All right, Mark, I'm going to go ahead and kick it over.
Okay, thanks. We'll see if we have an optimistic or a pessimistic. I'd say pretty optimistic. I speak a lot at conferences and ask this question a lot, and I get a lot of category C, I would say. Here we're kind of middle of the road, at least with almost 50% saying between 50 and 75%. So I'd say this is an optimistic crowd. So let's see how accurate a crowd you are. So employee engagement. To start this conversation, Gallup poll, we've all heard of Gallup. They do an annual survey of employee engagement across the U.S. They've been doing it since 2000, so we've got those statistics to share with you. It's approximately 100,000 workers, at least 18 ages up, and they're specifically assessing, and this Gallup does lots of surveying, and this particular one specifically focused on employee engagement levels. And so here's how it has averaged, and then we'll give you up-to-date numbers, basically since 2000 or last 20 years. Average number of engaged percent engaged, 30%. And then so that breaks down to 70% not engaged, roughly about 50% defined as not engaged and 20% actively disengaged. The non-engaged means you're kind of just going through the motions. You're doing your job. You may even be doing a good job, in your role, but you're just going through the motions. You're really not sort of invested in sort of what you're doing. You could all sort of just punching the time clock. And then the 20% actively disengaged means those are the individuals in an organization who are actively working against us. This place is not a good place to work. They're spreading discontent, so they're kind of working against you. And then that's estimated to be about a $650 billion per year productivity loss. Whatever that number is, all we need to think is, if in reality that, let's just say, a third of our workforce is actually truly cares about what they're doing, that they're really engaged. On one hand, how awful is that, and what a wake-up call, but on the other hand, what an opportunity, because it should not be that difficult to improve that. And so we did have a very optimistic crowd, which is great, but probably about double in terms of your estimate in terms of what it actually is across the U.S. So we have work to do. And then here just shows you the trend line. Actually, in this past year, and it was kind of big news, although I don't think hitting 35% is big news, but that was the all-time high. You can see that the green line, well, they're both green. The lighter green line, which is the top line, is the engaged percentage. So it's basically been gradually increasing over time, and certainly has been in the last 5 or so years, which is great. But I think we would all also agree that a 35% engaged is still nothing to write home about. So we got a lot of work to do. So given what's going on, and this is now back to some real-time COVID-related impacts for our organizations and things that we should be considering when we're having these types of conversations about our people. And this reflects both national sort of feedback and experience, and we can certainly validate as a firm because we're experiencing the same things. So cultural challenges. We are hearing from our employees that it's hard to maintain a culture when you're working either partially or fully remotely, because, and that's sort of an obvious statement, right? We're losing to some extent that in-person interaction, which is part of the DNA of all of our organizations. How much of the DNA is certainly going to vary, but that's placing strains on the organization. And when people say cultural challenges, they're really, in a way, saying they're not feeling as connected as they have been, which is a natural thing to occur given how our operating environments have changed. Productivity gains and losses. I've found this very interesting. And so there's really kind of two main thrusts here. One is if you do a lot of travel, and now you're able to get the same work done, for example, without travel. That can be both commuting and then actually traveling to other locations for business. We are experiencing productivity gains from getting that time back and being able to use that as working time versus transportation time. That's pretty intuitive. Of course, there's some drawbacks of not being able to do things in person, which is sort of a different issue, but we are actually getting productivity gains in terms of our time. And of course, people like not having to commute, and depending on how much you actually travel for business, might like that or not like that, depending on how much you enjoy doing it. The losses part was what was, I think, really interesting, which is that the losses part really segmented by sort of generation, and really as a simplified view of it is the more experienced employees, and we'll just say in this case older employees, are feeling less negative impacts on productivity, and contributing and younger workers are finding more difficulty maintaining their productivity, and I think that's very interesting. I think some of the contributing factors make perfect sense. So if you think of older workers, they are probably more likely to be in homes than maybe condos or apartments. They may more likely have kids out of the house or older kids versus younger employees who are going to tend to, if they have kids, they're going to be younger kids. And so you think about those impacts. Do I have dedicated space to do work if I'm working from home or in my home environment? Do I have distractions of kids and having to deal with them? And so those have natural impacts on your workday, natural impacts on quote unquote productivity. And then another comment in that regard is that the sort of the workday then blurring, right, or extending. I think for those of us who are working from home, I think we all experience the kind of what day it is, right? All the days kind of blur together because we don't have the variation or the markers of things that help us identify the part of the week it is and stuff, because things just seem to be like the same day over and over again. And so hearing that. So then there's the reluctance to return to the office or to work, and this is the safety aspect of it. And of course that's very natural, and that's pretty much just rooted in how safe is it going to be? Do I need to worry about contracting COVID? And what are we doing about that as organizations? And again, for those who are essential services, you've already had to deal with this. And for those of that who aren't, like an organization like ours, even though, we're an essential service because we're doing audits and tax, and those are required and essential, but it doesn't require us to be in the office to do it. And then really more speculative is this potential, and I think we've all probably heard about this, is potential increase or migration to the suburbs, where the trend has really been the reverse, kind of the migration, especially with the younger workforces, younger elements of the workforce sort of migrating to urban living, that this is has the promise or the perspective to sort of reverse that. And if that's the case, that has all sorts of potential implications to us in terms of, at a minimum, commutes, and that makes it tougher to attract and retain. Do we need to rethink our office space, our workspace? Do we need to rethink where our office or workspace is located, et cetera? I think that part that's one of the big question marks in terms of how is that going to play out and how do we respond to it? Okay. So the need for a different perspective. So this, I'm going to kind of ground mostly in a non-up or down market and just things that we need to do or think about our organizations for being competitive in the marketplace. If we were doing this webinar in February, one of the market factors would have been the labor market, and it would have been showing that we have unemployment percentage of less than 4%. So we've had a super competitive labor market. It was an employees market. Vying for them was, a lot of work. That has shifted, obviously, in this period, but it really hasn't shifted that much because even though we have a lot more available people in the workforce, we all know it's temporary. How much of a lasting impact does it have? That remains to be seen. But it's not like we're all seeking to hire at the pace we were in February, and now just have a much bigger supply to choose from. The hiring and the availability have sort of adjusted together. And so I don't think the dynamics end up changing that much, and I think that we'll return, hopefully, to a highly competitive marketplace again in 2021. So what do you need to be thinking about is that how does the market view you? Not as customers, because we always are thinking that way, but as employers, because your future employees are out in the marketplace, and how do they view your organization? How do you distinguish yourself, not just in your products and services, because those are the natural things that distinguish you, but in actually what type of organization you are to work for. And you always think of the saying, you join an organization and you leave a boss. Well, that's very true, but really, how do you market your organization as an employer versus someone who is serving your clients or customers? And then similarly, you always have to be thinking about how do your employees view you? And that's a little bit more natural because to be thinking that way, but thinking about them as, or do they truly view your organization as a place that aligns with their values, what they're looking for, that is a place that they can see themselves long term? This has become more important, certainly in stronger markets, becomes more important, but also in sort of the characteristics of the workforce. And there's always a lot of talk about the millennials and how do they participate in the labor market, and the comments about sort of moving in packs and the things that are important to them. Well, those are all things that should be causing us to think about how do our employees view our organization, and what do we do not only to get them, but to keep them, not only to keep them, but to make them as high value to the employer as possible, and how do you deliver as high value as possible to them for their career. And those might say, like, duh, we should be thinking those, but if you really think about it in that way, it's going to cause you perhaps to do different things. So then, really kind of what matters most. So many of us, I'm hoping on the call, have maybe heard of Simon Sinek, and he has a wonderful TED Talk on the golden circles, which is really what this represents. And he goes through a discussion that basically says, we all intuitively know what our organizations do. Hopefully, we have a good understanding of how we do it, kind of what our differentiation is, whether it's quality or cost or speed or whatever. But really what people care about is why your organization exists. What is it really trying to accomplish? And if what you do, the why, if that resonates with your employees, then that's where you're going to get high engagement, high buy-in, because they're invested in what you're trying to accomplish. But they need to understand truly what you're trying to accomplish, and they need to understand how they play an important role in that, from top of the organization to bottom of the organization in terms of hierarchy. And if you're able to really get that to resonate with them, that's where you really get traction. That's where you're firing on all cylinders. So it's your ability to really communicate the why to them and get them invested in that. And so that's part of what we'll be talking about also. So before we start to get in sort of the actual strategies, it's then how are we going to adjust to what we've just experienced? And one way to think of it is our goal as organizations to get back to exactly what we looked like in February, beginning of March, or is it to be how different based on what we've learned and experienced? And so some examples would be your finances. Are we gonna look for ways to operate more cost effectively, perhaps to create greater buffer, greater reserves to give us a better ability to absorb an impact like this? Now, no organization is going to prepare for the economy to shut down, right? That is not realistic. But how prepared are we for something in the future? The future can just be whatever this roller coaster is going to look like for the balance of the year in terms of the impacts of COVID. And so what's our ability to absorb that? Another thought is, to what extent might we try to adjust our operating model to be more based on variable costs today than in the past and less on fixed costs? And that can be in how we pay our people. It can be how we do things internally versus outsourcing. And again, ways that enable us to absorb and respond to external forces that are in some cases positive, and how to respond to that, but certainly in what we've just gone through, negative. Policies, procedures, and processes. So the obvious element of that is in working remotely, as many of our organizations still are, how do we adjust to that, both in the short term, just to deal with it, and depending on how we want to be able to operate in the future, accommodate that. This would classically come up relative to a protection of institutional knowledge as we lose people in the organization as they retire or lose from whatever reason, and how does the next person know what to do? But certainly when you're operating in a remote environment, it makes this that much more important. Use of technology, again, sort of an obvious one, but again, predicated on, so for example, if we chose maybe to not travel as much, let's say we have an organization of 20 offices, are we going to have as much internal travel as we used to, or might we reduce our costs, choose to reduce our costs because we've hopefully just experienced that doing things virtually maybe isn't so bad, and maybe we sprinkle in some of that in the future so that we reduce some of our own internal costs associated with that, and then how does technology play a role in doing it? Or moving forward, do we allow people to work at home more than we did previously? And again, the role of technology to do that. And then finally, which I was mentioning before, physical space. What is our physical space plan going to be moving forward? How might a change in where our workers are residing, sort of that, is there a suburban sort of migration? Is it big, small, non-existent? We don't know. But how do we respond to that? Do we respond to that with changing our physical space that exists today? Do we shift the location of our physical space? What does that look like? For sure, we know that we have to be dealing with in the short term is in essence, the safety of our physical space relative to COVID in terms of social distancing, cleaning, that type of stuff. We're all having to deal with that, but that hopefully will come and go. Okay, so employee engagement strategies. We're going to talk about 4 key strategies that every organization certainly should be able to be good at. Most organizations are not great at, and these are 4 practical things that you can do to definitely increase employee engagement, definitely increase the performance of your organization, and definitely translate into your ability to attract, retain, and motivate your workforce, regardless of market conditions. But I would submit become even more important in up and down market conditions, because everything gets accentuated in terms of impacts on your employees in that regard. So 4 things: how you plan for your business, we could call it strategic planning, how you define performance and track performance in your organization, how you develop or cultivate and compensate your employees, and how do you handle those 3 things so that they're in alignment. So whatever you do to one is in alignment with the others. And then 4, how do you effectively communicate that alignment needs to exist? In essence, that we have a plan, we have defined performance specifically to accomplishing what's in that plan, we have aligned in developing and compensating our people in accordance with that performance, and we do an effective job of sharing how that needs to work with our employee base. Because if we do those 4 things well, then employees will understand what we're trying to accomplish, planning, how we expect to accomplish a performance, what their role is, people in doing it, and if we do a good job of communicating that over the course of each year, then we're going to keep our people plugged in to what we're trying to accomplish, and they'll understand how they actually play a role in doing it. And they're not just showing up, doing their job and going home. They're showing up and actually thinking about, here's how I contributed to what my organization is trying to accomplish, because that's engagement. I'm going to skip that slide. We're actually going to go to our third polling question. Back to you, Dustin.
Thanks, Mark. So our question is, does your organization have a formal strategic plan? And just two answers, A, yes, B, no. And again, to answer the question, make sure you select the little checkbox next to the answer and hit submit. And for those of you that would like a copy of today's slide deck, you can download that from the folder that says slide deck and handouts to the right of the slide view. We'll also be sending out the slides via email after the webcast. A couple more seconds here. Okay, Mark, over to you.
Okay, I was going to say, hopefully we have a pretty high A here, and that's not bad. About, we'll say, call it about 2/3. I'd say my experience in general is that this is kind of in the 50 to 75% range of yes organizations that do. I know formal is a little bit subjective, but we're actually going to have a follow-on polling question to this one that just allows us to delve a little bit deeper. So back to you on that, Dustin.
All right, so who is involved in your strategic planning process? A, the board, B, executive management, C, board and executive management, D, all employees, or E, none of the above.
And you might say, what the heck is none of the above? None of the above might be like just the owners do it. So if you're a closely held business and you've got 3 owners and they just do it on their own. So that would be an example of none of the above. I guess none of the above could also be you don't have a strategic plan. So.
All right, I'm going to click it over to the answers here. Back to you, Mark.
Thank you. All right, so that's actually an excellent response, or excellent meaning that's what we like to see, which is board and executive management. We'd love to see even more so. Our goal would be all employees, but I think from a practical standpoint, that is a good response. A strategic plan just being developed and sort of residing at a board level, doesn't, I'll say, for example, doesn't have the investment of executive management in it. Not every organization has a board, so some of you may have selected executive management, but don't have a board, so it's not like they weren't participating in it. But sometimes that is the case. Executive management develops it and presents it to the board, and I'd say that's actually somewhat common, but in that case, we'd like to see that the board actually involved in the process. But we'll go through this. So thank you for those responses. So I'm not going to go through this in detail. I just want to plant some seeds in terms of strategic planning. So these are the components, I'll say, of a typical strategic planning process, or what we'd like to see in a typical strategic planning process. And I just want to break it down into 3 components, and then really we're going to relate it to the attracting, retaining, and motivating employees. The first sort of 5 boxes on starting from left to right: long-range view, historical financial results, target customer profile or client, whichever term you use, competitor best practice, the current SWOT analysis. These are your inputs. When you're doing strategic planning, you should have sort of this information should be on the table, so to speak, in terms of what you're drawing from. So long-range view, where are we ultimately trying to be? Are we, if we looked 25 years out, are we in business? Because maybe the goal is to sell the business. Is it a family business? Is it generational? And 25 years is nothing. We're thinking, 100 years. But what does the view that you really want to accomplish out many years, not just out your planning period? Your historical financial results, what actually contributed to getting you to where you are today? So really understanding over the last 3 to 5 years, how has your organization evolved? And for example, what's really driving the profits? What aspects of your business really translate into creating the profits that your organization realizes? Sometimes it's not exactly what you think, because a lot of times it's assumed. what your ideal target customer profile, what are really their characteristics or of your various targets, and what do you need to do to serve them. Really looking at your competitors. What do they do that they do better than you do, and what can you learn from them? Or what do they do that's just different from what you do? And again, what can you learn from them and incorporate into how you operate? And then really SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, really taking an objective look of where you are today and what are your opportunities for improvement. So those 5 things should be your inputs to a plan that really is, whether it's 3 years, 5 years, 4 years, looking out in terms of defining, so what are your goals, what are your objectives, what's your action plan? A plan shouldn't stop at goals and objectives. It should define exactly the things, not in every excruciating detail, but truly the actions you need to take, the who, what, when, to accomplish those goals and objectives, and usually looking at that over whatever time frame you're planning on sort of a quarterly basis. So what do we need to get done each quarter? And then what are you going to measure to see if you're on track, both in terms of executing the plan, so implementing it, and then also, of course, in terms of achieving the outcomes or the goals and objectives. And so how do you make sure you know whether you're on track or not? But the most important thing about that, to whatever degree you do planning is a scalable thing. It can be very formal and inclusive and detailed. It can be sort of back of the envelope as a other extreme. But really, it's, in a way, the process is just as important as the product or the output. And that's what I want to talk about. 2 things that we would love for your organizations to do, and this is to increase employee engagement, which ultimately will help with attracting, retaining, motivating employees, is 2 things. To elicit your employees' input on the front end of a strategic planning process. Use SurveyMonkey. Use something more sophisticated. All you need to do is reach out to them and ask them some simple questions. You can ask them for input on SWOT analysis. You can ask them for input on what are the 3 things they think the organization does best. You can ask them about why they stay with the organization. You can ask them about what 3 things the organization should be most focused on that they do today or don't. Anything, any form of questions that A, will give you some insights that's useful to your strategic planning, but B, just the fact that you're asking your employees for input goes a long way in helping getting them engaged, because you even care to ask, but that you're actually asking for, substantive input relative to your plan. So that's item 1. And then item 2 is, and I'm going to go to the next slide, is sharing your plan with them. Now, I know you can't read this, and that's purposeful, because this is an actual strategic plan on one 11 by 17-inch piece of paper, and it goes from top left mission to bottom right quarterly, action plans by year, and which includes the who, what, and when for achieving the goals and objectives. So this is like a 50-page strategic plan on one piece of paper. On 11 by 17-inch, you'd actually be able to read this. But the point of this is it enables you to do 2 things. To use your plan from a practical standpoint as an actual management tool, meaning you're not pulling out this plan that's most likely going to go on a shelf. That's not something that's probably going to happen on a day-to-day basis. This is something that you actually could, and this is out of the whole Japanese way, Hoshin planning of doing work and actually using your plan as a management tool. But secondly, this just shows how a full plan, and it doesn't necessarily have to be all the information, it depends on your organization, but something that you could practically share with all your employees. You can share 1 page with them that summarizes, in this case, in detail, but it could be at a more summary level, what your plan is with your whole employee base. So ask for the input at the front end, share the plan at the back end. If you do those two things, then you're going to have your employees much more engaged in what you're trying to accomplish. And for those of you who already do this, great. And for those of you who don't, I'm telling you, a very small percentage of organizations, I'm quite confident it's less than 10%, do what I just said. And what an easy thing to do. Okay, so that's the first thing, planning. And the second is performance. And this is more work because, or it's at least more work in terms of thinking, is thinking about the performance you want to accomplish sort of at three levels with your organization. The first is what would actually drive your strategic plan, what goals you're trying to achieve as an organization, whether it's revenue, profitability, diversification, expansion, whatever that is. But those are your, as we say here, enterprise or organization-wide goals. And then thinking of then metrics at the sort of the departmental level, and thinking them of every organization has two types of sort of services. Your direct services to your clients or customers, whether that's engineering, manufacturing, sales, etc., design, or your support services, HR, IT, finance, legal, facilities, etc. In that we should have specific metrics, and we're talking few metrics that are specifically tied to what you're trying to achieve as an organization as a whole. So if your goal is to double your revenue in the next 5 years, then what you're doing in each of those departments, whether direct or support, should be aligned with what you need to do to double your revenue in the next 5 years. And so we take a simple thing like people, well then you need to have human resources in recruiting, whether if it's separate from HR, with a plan in place to attain the resources and attain and retain the resources in order to fuel that amount of growth. And so they should have a metric or metrics that are tied specifically to that. And of course the details are, what's the composition look like, what's the development of the people look like, all that good stuff. But if their goal isn't to, let's say you need to increase your resources by 50% to get 100% revenue growth, then they have to have a plan, and they should have metrics to increase resources by 50% in 5 years and know whether you're on track to do that. And so you have to have that alignment. And then down at the individual metric level is thinking about what things do you expect, for example, every employee to have in common in terms of things like communication, working with others, team building, development of self, development of others, etc. And what would you measure there? And those are things that typically go into, for example, an annual performance review that equally applies to every employee, again, from bottom to top of the organization. But think of those three levels. What are we trying to accomplish as an organization as a whole? How does each piece of our organization support that and make sure that we've defined performance and are measuring it in a way that is specifically aligned with those enterprise goals and metrics? And then what are we expecting down at the individual level? And just think of it in terms of a simple thing, a dashboard. That's a in vogue term, but just what seminal metric, ideally one, in each function of your organization do you measure to give you a finger on the pulse of how the organization is doing towards achieving its strategic plan? Again, if it's double in 5 years in terms of revenue, then you're going to have easily specific goals in sales, marketing, product development, operations, right down the line here of things that need to be done. And so making sure that we've identified and measuring those things to make sure that we're on track. Because ultimately things are going to happen. You'll be off track, whether ahead or behind. And so then what do you do to make adjustments? But again, if we think of employee engagement, but then sharing this. So this would be, for example, something you would share in a quote-unquote all-hands meeting quarterly or something like that to be able to demonstrate, are we on track to achieving our vision for the organization, our strategic plan, and don't make that a mystery to them. Now I'm going to segue to people. So the first thing is, and this is certainly back to the workforce of today, which would seem more focused on this, but or we have more challenge in this, is that how do we show each employee that they have, a career here over an extended period of time? The days when someone worked for a company for 40 years or their whole career, that's really rare these days. And so it makes this more important to try to be able to actually show our employees what a career path looks like. This is showing a career path like it's a progression, sort of, even though it's horizontal, but it'd be vertical in the organization. But that's not necessarily the case. It could be a technical path that's continuing to build technical expertise and acumen over a career versus, managerial responsibility moving up, sort of the ladder or the hierarchy. But we have to be able to show them what that looks like. And we probably say, yeah, well, we all do that. Okay, but then are we doing the things to actually make that practical? And I know you can't read this one either. This is an actual excerpt from Moss Adams' Competencies. But what we define here, going across the top, it's each level in our organization. So staff, senior manager, for particular competencies, what we expect to see to be operating effectively at each of those levels, or what you need to be able to do to get to those levels. So you've actually defined what competency needs to exist for someone to progress within the organization from one role to the next. And then what would go hand in hand with this would be a development plan. What's the employee going to do? What's the employer going to do to help cultivate these competencies? And so, of course, that's a dual effort, but it's actually, getting that stuff defined, not just stuff that we talk about like on the prior slide and say, well, you need to, this is the next step for you. It's like, but how do you actually get there? And if getting there is just waiting for someone to retire, that's not too motivating, or someone to leave. And so then just also acknowledging that those competencies are going to vary, of course, across the organization by function. They're going to vary by level in the organization in terms of, depending on your role, how much people management you're going to do, how much service delivery. So you might be early in your career more technically focused and more on service, and later in your career perhaps more on managing people. But like I said before, maybe you just have a technical career, and that service delivery and technical development are the things that are most prominent because that's the nature of the role. But knowing that we need to define things in a way that's not a one-size-fits-all. Now, there's a lot of work in doing this stuff, so it's easier said than done, developing competencies. But these are things that, again, help an employee to actually picture how this is achievable, and that what they actually need to do and are the things that can then actually make performance reviews more meaningful than perfunctory, because then you're focusing your performance reviews not only on what they've done in terms of how they've performed, but also what they're doing to develop themselves in demonstrating the competencies that are to take to progress through the organization. But again, you're helping them see it and envision it and making it more real, and then more responsible for it. And then the last couple slides, so on people dealing with compensation, and we could have a whole conversation, of course, just on this. And this can vary some, certainly, depending on market conditions, and certainly in better markets versus worse markets, it becomes more prominent because the competition goes up. But basically thinking about sort of two things on this slide: how do sort of the three general forms of compensation play into factor in how you compensate your people? Cash, so salary and bonus; equity, and that can be real, so real stock, or any of the many forms of sort of phantom stock where it's not actually ownership and not actually voting. And then deferred comp, how do we introduce compensation programs that reward you in the long term for sticking around? In a way, sort of the golden handcuffs. How do we and equity can do that, but lots of organizations don't have equity, and deferred has become a lot more popular, and certainly the last 10 years, maybe a little bit shorter than that, because of the baby boomers and organizations recognizing that we have a large number of highly experienced people leaving. We need to identify that next wave of leadership. How do we try to lock them in for the long term? And so deferred comp has become much more popular as a result of that. So how do those three things, or how do any one, two, or three of those components factor in terms of how we're compensating our people? And if I had anything for you to take away in terms of compensation, is how do we tie compensation to performance? So here's another general comment. The vast majority of our organizations who have a bonus, it's discretionary. And while that may seem very benevolent, you're losing your strategic value of a bonus by not tying it to performance. And I don't mean performance of the company, because that's inherent. Did we have a good year? Yes, everyone's going to get X% bonus. That's benevolent and nice, but it doesn't distinguish between what one person contributed versus another, and it's not getting you the strategic value or the impact that you could have. And so thinking of performance, and this is one of the reasons we talked about metrics at 3 levels, is being able to tie performance to how a person, an employee, factors into impacting the organization, but also not making it siloed or individual, to focused on just what they do. So what this is showing is tying a portion of incentive compensation to how the company does, to how their department or team, however you want to define a subgroup within the organization, and how they do individually. And what's highlighted in the green is, but aligning the largest portion of those 3 components, what they actually have the most impact. So an executive has most impact on how the organization or company does as a whole. Someone in management, which I know is a broad term, has more impact on what their particular function is, whether it's department, division, team, and staff as a general term, more has impact on what they do individually. But you want them also to be invested in or caring about how, not just how they do, each person, how their team does, and how the company does as a whole. And so aligning that with their level to contribute. Okay, and then I'm going to wrap up quickly here with communication, and that is, again, thinking of quarterly or annually or semi-annually communicating how you're doing as an organization against your plan, your target, your actual, so that your workforce understands how you're doing. You can use a simple green, yellow, red to keep them on track, and have some kind of communication cadence or rhythm. That's all the more important today as we're working more remotely, and use different methods: email, video, recorded message, but be thinking at these different levels, your organization or strategic plan as a whole, how each component of the organization is doing, how your team or individuals are doing, and have a cadence to that, and share the information that gets them engaged in what they're doing. And so I've gone right up to the wire here, Dustin. I don't know if we have time for maybe one question, if you've got any juicy question from our participants, or we need to wrap it up. I'll let you decide.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. We are at the top of the hour, so unfortunately I don't think we're going to have time for the Q&A. But thank you very much for the great presentation today. If we didn't have time, if you did submit a question, folks, and we didn't have time to get to it, we will try to do our best to reach out to you after after today's webcast. And just as a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in the slide deck and handouts window to the right of the slide view. And if you participated as an individual and met all the certification requirements, your certificate is available to download in the CPE progress window to the right of the slide view. I'll keep the webcast console open for a few minutes to give you time to download your CPE certificate. A copy of your CPE certificate will be emailed within 3 weeks should you have any difficulty downloading it now. And here's a link to an online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete the survey as your feedback is very important to us. And thanks again, Mark, for the presentation, and thank you everyone for joining us. We hope you'll join us again next time.